We're talking today with Frank Anthony of Twin Lake, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Frank, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born February 6, 1947, Muskegon, Michigan. Went to school in Muskegon. My stepdad had a six-stall repair garage, so I went from there to Ferris State College, taking automotive. You asked me earlier how I got in the military. At that time, I was engaged, and next 5 years, I'd be able to spend one together. Didn't make any sense. She was at one school, I was at another. If I volunteered for the draft, it was 2 years. If you go sign up, it was a minimum of 3. So I went to the draft board, put my name at the top of the list, got myself drafted. Of course, you can't tell her that.
All right, let's fill in a little bit around this here. When did you finish high school?
1965.
Okay, and then you started at Ferris?
Yes.
Okay, and how long did you attend there?
The technical program went year-round.
Okay.
So I did a 2-year degree in a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And so that'd get me out of there in 67.
And is that when you then entered the service?
Yeah, got my draft notice and then went into the military in 67. At that time, they sent you the draft notice. You went to a collection point somewhere. They checked all your names. You got aboard a bus. We went down to Detroit and had our physical. You passed your physical. You raised your right arm. You were sworn in. That afternoon, we got on a train in Detroit, and it traveled down to Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Okay. When you were doing the physical, did you notice anybody trying to scam the system or find ways around going in?
Actually, at that time, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was just, you know, everything was so unusual. I don't normally walk around in my underwear standing in line, and it was really different and weird, and really wasn't watching. But of course, we'd talked about maybe wearing somebody else's, you know, wearing ladies' underwear or something, and seeing how well that'd work. Or, but no, I wasn't really looking for anything like that. I was of the mindset that this was my turn to serve my country, and someday I'd have to face myself in the mirror. And when it was my turn, was I willing to go? I mean, it wasn't that I wanted to. It was just, it fell in there. I knew I was going to go sooner or later. Everybody was getting drafted. And I was going to go and get it out of the way and come back. And of course, you know, at that age, if they tell you there's going to be 2/3 casualty, you look to your left and you look to the right, and you think, poor sucker. You know, you're young, you're invincible, and nothing's going to happen. Looking back and knowing then, I was willing to write, I guess what you'd call a blank check, realizing that things could happen, that I might die, that I might not come back. Well, I never expected to come back the same. My mother said the young lad she sent to war never came back. Physically, I never got injured. And I don't know what she's referring to, because changes happen gradually and slowly, and I don't know. But I know I saw men die because somewhere in their chain of command, people didn't stand up and say something. And I got determined I wasn't going to be one of them. And so like now, maybe I was a little outspoken.
All right, let's going to go back here now to your story. So you go, they take you down to Fort Knox.
Fort Knox, Kentucky, for basic training.
Right.
And that's a lot like the movies, you know. What are you doing on my bus? I got a 90-year-old grandma can move faster than you do. You know, you're lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. You ain't going anywhere for 6 out of 8 weeks of training because you're so stupid. And they literally grind you down, wear you out, and start trying to rebuild you. And you're learning the basics, because everybody in the military has to be a trigger puller at one time or another, or could be. So you learn the basics. You learn basic first aid. You learn how to put on your gas mask and how to take it off and scream "No, Sergeant" and try and put it back on and clear it. You know, how to use a rifle. Some basic hand-to-hand physical training.
Okay. What about the drill and discipline part?
Oh yeah, you're marching everywhere you go. You don't go any place alone. It wasn't as bad as later in the NCO Academy and in flight school and some other stuff. If there were two of you going somewhere, one of you is marching and one of you is calling cadence. But you know, it wasn't that bad in basic. But yeah, okay. Everywhere you go and you're marching. When you got up further, like in NCO Academy or in flight school, good share of the time, if you're going there where you were running, weather got too bad and the wet ball was up high enough, you could pull your shirt out, you could unblouse your boots, stuff like that. And if it got bad enough, then they didn't run us. But no, you were running.
Okay. Now, what time of year were you at Fort Knox?
May.
Okay. All right. And when you're talking about sort of the process of breaking people down and building them back up and so forth, what kinds of things would they do to break people down?
Well, it seems like all the way through training they only tell you about half of what you're supposed to know. So they don't tell you they're going to bounce a quarter off your bed, and if it don't bounce, they're pulling all the covers off. They come in and tell you everything's got to be evenly spaced in your floor locker and then foot locker, and then they come in with a ruler and actually measure it. You don't have a ruler. Of course, this sort of nonsense continued all the way up, only it got more stringent. But they'd check and do the same thing. They'd measure every one of your uniforms in your closet or your wall locker and measure them across, and they got to be equally spaced. And then they start looking at the individual uniforms, and if you didn't button a pocket, you want that button? Here you go, you can have it. Oh, you don't want it? Okay, throw it away. Check for threads, anything and everything. They're making sure that they're being so ridiculous that there's no way you can meet their standard.
Mm-hmm. All right, and the point of that is?
I'm not sure. I know when I got into the NCO Academy and the flight school, they wanted us to pull together. And we got to a point where we weren't totally rebellious, but if the TAC officer was messing with one of the troops, you'd hear somebody in the back say, "Fire mission!" And we'd go out and get on our, one guy'd get out and get down on all fours and put his arm out, and somebody else would be the forward observer, and he'd be out there, and somebody'd be the FDC, and they'd be yelling back and forth to each other, and then somebody'd play the artillery round that went out to the target, and we'd just start harassing them. We'd be marching somewhere, and somebody hollered, "T-Berry, shuffle, march!" And the whole formation start doing this T-Berry shuffle, and then he'd stop, and he'd get all upset with us and make us right face so that we're facing them instead of being in column to march. And what are you doing? I remember in flight school one time we got some kittens. I don't know where they came from, and we put them in the TAC officer's drawer of his desk. He found them, and everybody fall out. And, "Who put the kittens in my drawer?" And you hear from the back, "The shadow, he knows." And we ain't telling, And so then he made them all honorary officers. Well, that didn't sound bad if you're a civilian, but if you're in that kind of training, anytime an officer walks down the hallway, if he gets anywhere near close, you're at attention, what we call brace the wall. You're at attention up against the wall, just tight as you can get. And as he passes it, "Sir, Ken Anthony, good afternoon, sir." And if he stands in front of you, you ain't going anywhere. Well, we had to do the same thing for all the kittens. Well, it didn't take long. The kittens disappeared. They want you to start pulling together and somewhat, fighting back, so to speak, but not. I mean, we filled this room with balloons one day. You opened this door and all the balloons fell out. I mean, we literally filled up the last of the balloons out on, I don't know how to explain it. The buildings had a long concrete piece that went out. It was kind of like an awning down south, so they shaded things below.
Yeah.
Well, we stood on that and stuffed the last of the balloons in the windows and then pulled the window closed. So when he opened the door, the balloons literally fell out. And Sergeant, TAC officer just looked at that, and he didn't. So then he got a folding chair and a folding table, and he went down to the latrine. And he put that in the latrine. When you walk down to use the bathroom and you walk in, "What are you doing in my office?" Out you go. Well, if you went to his office, you had to stand in the doorway, pound on the door frame, and finally he'd say, "Do I hear a termite in my wood? Sir, can't you request permission to enter, sir?" "What do you want to enter my office for, sir?" "Sir, I'd like to use the urinal, sir." "You want to do what in my office?" Didn't take us long. We got rid of all the balloons. But they're trying to get you to pull together as a unit, together, to function together. The rest of it, to answer your question, was probably attention to detail.
Mm-hmm.
My wife tells me that I notice things that I guess nobody ought to notice, which was interesting because later while flying in Vietnam, I noticed that there were a series of charcoal kills, and that the fifth one there they never lit. Reported it, patrol went out, it was full of ammo. We're out another night, and you just notice things that, I don't know, why do you notice them? I just notice them.
Okay. Now, initially, you're going in, you're drafted, draftee normally serves for 2 years.
And back then it was strange because if you were a draftee, your Social Security, your military number started with U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And if you signed up, you were RA.
Yeah.
And U.S. was really looked down on because you were the scum they had to come get. I mean, that's kind of the... And at the end of basic, they flew in a helicopter for orientation to how you approach it, because you never approach a helicopter from the back. You approach it from the side or from the front. The blades can flex, so you do want to bend down. While you can stand up and get under them most of the time, you get a gust of wind or something, you may end up being a little shorter real quick. Mm-hmm. So they're teaching us how to get aboard them, how to get off them, how to approach them. And I noticed that the pilot was not wearing a hat. He's got a scarf around his neck, and he's wearing sunglasses. And nobody's harassing him, nobody's bothering him, and I'm thinking, huh. And then I'm being trained infantry, and I'm figuring I'm going to be eating out of cans and living out of a hole. And if I was flying that thing, maybe they'd put it in a safe place, and you get 3 hots and a cot each day. And all of a sudden, maybe life was looking a little better. And all the time through basic, they were talking to me about officer candidate school. I got some college behind me. Testing showed that for some reason I was a good candidate for leadership. And they were insistent I was going to go to OCS, and I was just insistent I wasn't. And we were at an impasse. And when I saw this, I asked about flight school, and they started processing a request. And then the Army doesn't sit still, and they don't do anything fast. So out of basic training, I went to advanced infantry school at Fort McClellan, Alabama.
Okay.
And that was an interesting base because that's also WAC training center. That's also chemical warfare school at that time. So that was an interesting base to go to. And there they went through, I think they called it fast aptitude test, was flight selection. And helicopter?
Could be airplane.
And they did a bunch of those kind of things. And then somewhere in the rest of my career for quite a while, they sort of lost it. I can make assumptions why. Out of advanced infantry school, they sent me to the NCO Academy.
Well, let's back up again to the infantry school here. You made a comment about you've got wax training there, you've got chemical warfare school. I mean, how much of that did you see or were you aware of or affected your experience there? Well,
first off, when you get there, any school you go to, you're going to start at the bottom of the pile. You're lowering a snake's belly in a wagon rut, lowering whale stuff on the bottom of the ocean, and common comments made. You're not going anywhere for quite a while. I don't remember whether the school was 8 weeks or 12 weeks, but somewhere in that area. And you're not going much of any place till the end of it. Last maybe 3-4 weeks, you may be getting passes regularly and you can go somewhere. So really didn't affect, you didn't see much of it. You weren't doing much. You saw what they wanted you to see. I mean, they'd set up a mock village there that we'd try and cordon in the mornings, so you learn how to navigate a little bit in the morning, how to link up with other infantry troops in the dark and not shoot each other, how to get up then and slowly move into the community, how to go through the community. And they had people that were civilians from the local area that were functioning as villagers. And so they tried to make the training as realistic as they could.
Now, was the harassment from the instructors?
Still kept up.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Matter of fact, later, and my wife gets a big kick out of it, later I mentioned I went through the NCO Academy, and then they sent me back to Fort McClellan to teach AIT. So now I'm Barney Bad, and I'm the one walking down the middle and pounding on the top of the trash can, telling everybody to get up and hit it in the morning. And you know, the crazy thing about it is, if you are the trainee, you don't realize that your TAC officer went to bed after you did and gets up before you did. And I was trained that if you want to know what your boots look like, you look at mine. So you don't really realize that it's kind of a reverse thing. You know, you're always in your own little world and you feel sorry for yourself. But you know, looking back, it's easy to see it wasn't that difficult. When you're going through it to begin with, it turns your world upside down, and it's something like you've never been through before. And but every time you go up in one of the schools, it gets crazier and it gets worse, and it gets longer.
Okay. I think at that time AIT was normally 8 weeks, and so was basic training. And then more specialized schools then vary or go longer.
And I don't remember how long the NCO Academy was.
Yep.
I do remember that that was it wasn't a volunteer. I didn't ask. And they called it shake and bake. That's what the guys called it. Vietnam was very much a small unit warfare, and they were having trouble finding, promoting, having enough non-commissioned officers that were knowing what they're doing. I mean, it always amazes me, the military, after a war, starts forgetting everything they learned and starts getting rid of all the people that have the most experience and the most training, probably because they're paying them the most. But there's a reason why. I mean, you take something like Special Forces I worked with, it takes years, and I mean literally, I mean, we ain't talking 1 year. They go through, if you're standard Special Forces, you go at least through 2 years of school, and then take a year with a unit and another year to shake out. Probably takes somewhere between 4 to 5 years for you to really start knowing what you're doing and how to do it, and you're performing and independent, and then they take a look and how many of these guys do we need, and they start cutting back, and they start forgetting all the stuff that really made it work.
But basically in Vietnam, they had built up the Army very quickly, as well as the Marine Corps. They needed people to be the squad leaders and do a lot of that kind of stuff, and so they have to create a bunch quickly. So most of them are picked out of basic training or AIT and said, hey, you have leadership material. But in your case, was this a stepping stone to go to flight training, or a way to just kill time?
I don't think so. I think I'm one, I fit the criteria, they just took me and put me there. Like I said, I went back and trained AIT. Then after that, they pulled me again and sent me to long range recon school. Because at that time, I didn't know it at the time, but at that time they were having like 90% casualty rate for the recon patrols that were going over the border into Laos and Cambodia. And they needed people. And that's where I was when my request for flight school finally caught up to me. And I think it was due to a chaplain that I'd went and talked to and says, you know, somewhere back in basic, I requested flight school. They did the testing, but it didn't happen. And I think it was due to him that they finally messed around. I found out later that they started, they have a certain washout rate they expect. And I guess the washout rate was a lot heavier than they expected. And I don't think they wanted to let me go. I think they needed numbers. I was one of the numbers. I was evidently successful. And
so washing out of the Ranger training?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, you say Ranger training. It's difficult to tell who there was doing what, because we had Special Forces, we had Rangers, we had CIA, we had some Mercs that were all trained in school. You can say it was at Fort Benning, but we got to Benning, they issued our field gear, and we went to, I think it was a week or so, we went to some classes. And after that, we were in the field. And they never give us enough map to really know where we are, because we'd have walked out. And we're running around out there in the middle of no place, and they're supposed to drop us supplies. And you get on the radio and you talk to the L-19 bird dog, and he's coming in, and he tells you to authenticate, and you authenticate, and then he tells you you're wrong, so he doesn't drop your supplies. So the next 2 days you're chasing snakes and purifying water, maybe by boiling it or whatever. And the people that are training you, you have an aggressor force, they already know the whole agenda. They know where you're supposed to be. They know where you're supposed to go. So we got original. I mean, if we're supposed to go over here, what's the shortest route? Let's take the long way. We didn't want to play their game. But I think that's too part of what they wanted to teach you. But if you went the straight way, you were going to get caught. And they weren't nice to you if they caught you. And so, anyway.
All right. So at what point then do you finally actually get to flight school? And when is it that you start that?
I was out in long-range recon school when helicopter came in at one point, and they called off names, and I thought they had a package or something. And I came forward, and he says, "Get aboard the bird. Top wants to see you, First Sergeant." So I got aboard the helicopter and took me back to main base, and Top says, "Got orders, you're going to flight school." Well, that was another week or two away, so they sent me over to Chapel Hill there at Fort Benning, and I was Barney Bad at large, harassing a whole bunch of people's troops. I'm not responsible for any of them. I'm just harassing a whole bunch of them because I've been trained to do that, you know. So, well, you take the guys to the field, I go flip their bunks, I turn their footlockers upside down, I write up all the demerits, you know. So I did that for a couple weeks, and then I went over for flight school. And in flight school, again, you're starting at the bottom of the barrel.
Okay, but do you remember roughly when, chronologically, you showed up at flight school?
No.
Okay. Are we in 1968 now?
You know, my wife and I were talking, and after a while, you realize in your life you end up with a hole. I'll hear some music. I'll watch a great event that happened on TV, and I'll go, "Wait a minute, when was that?" And they'll tell you, go, "Oh, that must have been when I was at Fort Benning, or that must have been where I was overseas or something." Because you're so busy, you're not watching the afternoon news. Your schedule is very much, they wake you up at 6 o'clock and put you to bed whenever they feel like it, and may get you up in the middle of the night again. And if you're back in the barracks, you may be cleaning your rifle, you may be cleaning your field gear, you may be using a toothbrush and cleaning the grout in the shower. I mean, you're busy. And they make sure you're busy all the time. And you got a weekend pass, you don't know a whole lot about the town. You don't know a whole lot about anything. You pretty generally will leave base because you've seen enough of that.
All right. But sometimes events do intrude. Do you remember where you were when Martin Luther King was assassinated?
Oh, yeah. At that time, I'd been through the NCO Academy. I was training troops at Fort McClellan. We were in the field, and all of a sudden we got orders. We're to come back to base, right in the middle of our field training. Doesn't make any sense. So we come back to base, and first thing I notice is sitting alongside the barracks is a flatbed truck with 2 armored personnel carriers on it. And there's one sitting next to the next barracks. And we come in, and Martin Luther King's been assassinated, and we're on standby duty for riot control to go to Atlanta. And my guys are then cleaning their guns and getting equipment ready. And crazier thing too, sidelight personal note, the gal I volunteered for the service the day I got the draft notice, her and I broke up. She didn't know I volunteered for draft, and you ain't going to tell her, because if you get hurt, you don't want her feeling responsible. But somewhere in there, I dated another gal, and we were getting fairly serious. She was in Muskegon, and she'd write me, she wants to come down and visit me. And I'm not exactly in training, I'm training people. And there's 2 sergeants. So one sergeant can stay with the guys. I can have every weekend off, or half a day off, or a day off every week, or whatever we want. And she's going to come down and visit me at the base. And I write her and tell her no, and I get from her letters that she ain't paying attention. So I wrote her daddy and told her that nice things don't happen to little girls down at military bases, and you ought to keep her home. He writes me back, and as long as I meet her and she's with me, he doesn't care. And I'm going, no, you ain't listening. And right in the middle of me getting the guys back and everything's in turmoil, I hear a whole bunch of fox whistles and stuff going on. And I walk out of my room and into the barracks. Well, at that time, I'm a sergeant, and these guys are in training, so you hear, Eddies! And the place is stone quiet. And look down the middle of the barracks, because the bunks are down both sides, and the guys don't even walk in the middle. I mean, you carried a sock that you had split, and you put it over the nose of your shoe and brought it up, and you tied it over the instep, so that if you walked in the middle, you were polishing it. And then when you took that off, it went inside your tunic, and you stuffed them on both sides because you kept the floor nice and polished. And I was a sergeant, so I walked down the center, walk wherever I want to. Sharon had walked in the barracks on the other end and was walking down the middle of the barracks. That's what the guys were all hooting and hollering about. And I told her, I says, my room down there. Guys, I appreciate your taste. I think you got other things in here. Woo, you got stuff to take care of. And I went back. But we were completely sequestered to the base. I borrowed a vehicle from the chaplain's assistant, and knowing the base, because I'm training and out there with the guys everywhere, I went off the back of the base so I didn't go through the guards. We're sequestered, I can't get off. And I took her out to a hotel and dumped her at the hotel and told her I'd be back the next day if things permitting. And so yeah, I remember real well what happened when Martin Luther King got, because all of a sudden everything's in the air and I'm kind of juggling stuff, and it was crazy.
Okay, so that kind of works back to the question I'd asked about when you started flight school. So it's going to be after all that.
Oh yeah.
And then your Ranger Special Forces training, whatever that was,
That
comes
was
after
after that.
that. So is flight school still in 1968 when you start that, do you think?
Yes.
Okay. But later in the year.
I got to Vietnam in the middle of '69, and flight school was 9 months long, because we always joke the difference between a warrant officer and a hard bar, your lieutenants, and that is OCS, Officer Candidate School, 6 months. And flight school for warrant officer candidates is 9 months. And the extra 3 months burns out our military bearing.
All right. Now, talk just a little bit about, because a lot of people are not familiar with this kind of thing. What's the relationship between a warrant officer and a conventional officer?
A warrant officer is warranted his commission. He's not a commissioned officer. His job is normally one where he's a specialist or a highly trained technician. He may work in electronics, he may be a pilot, he may be a special supply officer, he may be a personnel warrant. He knows all the rules, the regulations, stuff like that. He does not have troop command. So there's your major separation. Difference being is Special Forces later made a warrant as the executive officer of an A-team because they went up so far in the enlisted ranks, going up sergeants and that, they wanted to make a slot to keep some career people, and captain, a lieutenant or a captain is normally the leader of an A-team, and the executive officer, they finally made them warrants. But that's the only place I know where they have any sort of troop command. And again, that's a highly trained specialist. He's not really running a whole lot of troops. He's...
Yeah, and I guess the officers, normally officers move around to different assignments.
Warrant officers also have a specific branch.
And so they may stay there longer.
Yeah, and when I was in, well, that's not true, because warrants, they now have a W-5. You had W-1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. When I was in, they only went to W-4. So you had plenty of ranks to go up. But again, I was responsible for the aircraft. I was responsible for flying it and understanding all that. And that's basically my job. Now, all officers have other assignments. For instance, when I got to Vietnam, I was put in charge of the Officers Club. And I told the old man, I said, wait a minute, you don't want me in charge of the Officers Club. I said, I'm a Mormon. I don't drink. I says, I don't know the difference between all your liquors and stuff. Well, I didn't end up with the job very long because since I don't drink, I made sure there were plenty of other pops and things. And I guess the sale of liquor went down. But he also told me, he says, you don't understand. He says, I'm putting you in charge of the liquor locker because you're the only one we trust with the key. That didn't sound real logical to me, but anyway. But they all have other jobs. At one point I was in charge of POL, petroleum oil and lubricants, and parts for the aircraft. At one point I was a safety officer. Then at another point I was made the executive officer of the aviation company. That was again the old man up at group. During the monsoons, a number of our people got weathered in, went down through the ranks, and it happened to be I was the guy with the standing seniority and so on and so forth, so I take over. But I'd been an NCO. I'd trained troops. I had a different way of dealing with things, and I guess I got all the work done and everybody was happy, and the old man says, you're still the executive officer. And I reminded him there were several officers that outranked me in our aviation outfit, and he says, doesn't matter. He says, you're the executive. So I took care of all the enlisted men. I took care of the maintenance, the parts, the fuels, some of the same stuff I was doing before, safety. I was supervising all that sort of stuff. But really, you talk about troop command yet, I'm still not commanding troops per se.
Now, we had gotten in your story here to basically we have you now starting flight training to become a helicopter pilot. So how did that, what was that process? Where did you go? What were you doing?
Mineral Wells, Texas. It's south and west of Fort Worth, Dallas. And most forbidden place you've seen. I mean, barren, wide open, hot, dry. But they picked it because the density altitude of the air, they said, was going to be similar to Vietnam to flying. And they had 3 basic helicopters for us to start primary training with. One was a TH-55 by Hughes. One was an OH-13, which is what you see them flying in MASH. And then the other one was a Hiller OH-23. And it looks similar to the one you see in MASH. It has the same type of plexiglass front, but it has an enclosed bottom and tail boom. And they all have piston engines. And you, first off, try and learn to hover, which is the single most difficult maneuver you're going to do. And if you don't hover by about 18 hours, if they figure you'll do it in the next couple hours, they'll keep, otherwise they'll recycle you. And you get to start over with a whole nother unit and come through and try and learn. But they start off, you have classes in aerodynamics, you have classes in Well, you got to learn what all the gauges are supposed to say, which is later you'll learn. They don't tell you this right away, but later you'll learn that they actually rotate the gauge so all the needles point upright. And if everything's proper in the aircraft, you look at all the engine instruments, all the needles are straight up and down. You don't have to read each one of them, but to start with, literally, you memorize every one. And by the time we got to the Huey, I don't know if you've ever seen a cockpit of one of them, but overhead there's a panel about yay wide, and it's probably about 2.5 feet long, and over half of it is circuit breakers. And you put your hand up like this, and you feel the row, and right there, and that one, that's the attitude indicator. And you know where the stuff is. So you got stuff like that you got to learn. You got to learn the velocity not to exceed V&E, stall speed. Helicopter doesn't have one, but you have all the characteristics of whatever aircraft you're flying. You have to learn. And so you have an immense amount of book work. You have an immense amount of stuff you have to memorize. Plus, all of a sudden, you're getting in this aircraft, and it's kind of like trying to learn to ride a bike. The helicopter won't do anything by itself automatically. Everything is uncoordinated. After you've done it a while, my wife was asking me a question the other day, and I literally had to go and I'd move my other foot and go, oh, it's that pedal, and it's, you know, because I've done it so much, it's automatic now, and I don't even think we got that muscle memory kind of thing going. But you literally learning everything from scratch, and it's just overload. Plus, you're still living in a barracks where everything is sterile, everything's waxed and polished. We had something about the size of a small tackle box that was our personal box. And there we could keep a second razor so we didn't have to polish it and clean it absolutely, so that the one that was on display was actually decent. That's where your letters went, your personal stationery, stuff like that, because that stuff wasn't available to be on display. Interesting story about that. I had my scriptures out, and I was studying one night, and I had to use the restroom real fast, and we had 3 guys to a room, and they said they'd watch it, and I took off for the bathroom, and I come back, and my scriptures are gone. Where are they? Well, the TAC officer come along. So this is improper display. He picked it up, he took them. So I went down, I braced in his doorway, and I beat on the door, and he asked who was there, and I go, Officer Cannon, what do you want, sir? Sir, I want my scriptures back. Well, he says it's going to cost me so many demerits. I told him I'd take double the demerits if he'd keep them and read them. He threw them at me, told me to get out of his office. But, you know, they're doing a lot of this stuff to see how you think under pressure, what you do, how you're going to behave. Do you cave under stuff like that? And like I said, they want us to start working together as a group. So, and it doesn't change. Like I said, in the schools I was in, the further up I went, I'm still in training. If I'd been a hard bar, a lieutenant, if I come out of OCS and went to flight school, out of officer candidate school, I'd been going to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and going home at 3 o'clock at night, and probably living off the base or living in the bachelor officer's quarters. Nobody's messing with me. I mean, I got a maid to take care of the place. You know, I do whatever I want to do. But we were warrant officer candidates. So this is like officer candidate school. And ours is 9 months long, not 3 months. And we're living in this vacuum besides trying to learn how to fly and do everything else. And so it's enough to make you sleep well at night.
Now, you've gone through an awful lot of this process of sort of being, you know, hazed or beaten into shape in each of these places. So were you used to it by this time? Did you kind of know the drill or the system and just...
There's always a new bent, there's always a new twist, there's always something that's different. For instance, in flight school, they found a dead fly on a windowsill one day while doing an inspection. So we had all our weekend passes canceled. We had a dead aviator. We had to have a funeral. with all military honors, and we didn't have guns, but guys had to go over there and get down on all fours and raise their arms. And we had a 21-gun salute, and I mean, we went through all the nonsense, everything you think of. In basic, I don't remember trying to AIT, no. NCO Academy, they started having something called taxi time. And if you got enough demerits, you not only didn't get a weekend pass, but you had to get your gun out, and you went out to a parking lot, and there were lines drawn across the parking lot. And if you had so many demerits, you had an hour of taxi time. If you had so many more demerits, you had 2 hours of taxi time. And you went out there and you started on the line and you walked to the other end of the parking lot on your line, did an about face, and you marched back. And you did an about face and you marched back and you put in your taxi time. Mm-hmm. And I remember doing that, the NCO Academy, and we had similar kind of things we had to do at flight school then. And so they always got a new little twist, a new way of playing. I don't remember them falling us out and having us low crawl someplace and then inspecting our uniforms until I was in flight school. I do remember they fell us out middle of the night for fire drill when we were in the NCO Academy. But we got to the point they'd fall us out in the middle of the night and we'd fall out going M-I-C-K-E-Y M-O-U-S-E, Mickey Mouse, down the duck, Mickey Mouse. You know, we're fighting back. Mm-hmm. We're doing our thing with them. But there's always one step up, one new little twist, something different they're doing. Like we didn't have to brace the wall, Sir Kennedy Anthony, good afternoon, sir, in the NCO Academy or any of that kind of stuff. But in flight school, yep. Okay. And flight school barracks were different. We weren't in a big wide open barracks. We were in individual rooms. There were 3 guys to a room. We had lockers. We had drawers built in the wall. Accommodations were nicer. Still wasn't air conditioned, but was much nicer. Still had to do pull-ups or push-ups or other things to get in the mess hall. I was telling you earlier we had brass that we had on our collars, WOC, because we're warrant officer candidate. And they'd find somebody had the brass on wrong. They'd make them fall out. What's this? You're a cow. C-O-W. You got brass on backwards, so you're a cow. So they made them run around the barracks going, I'm a cow, moo, I'm a cow, moo. Make them run around the formation. I mean, they always come up with something different, and they were always finding unique ways to mess with you. Mm-hmm. But it was the same old thing. You just, what I want to say, you can't get into a groove. They make sure there's no way you can just kind of slough it off, forget about it, whatever. Okay. Doesn't happen.
All right. Now, the flying part itself, how quickly did you kind of get the hang of a helicopter?
I had trouble. Everybody's different. While I'm quite physically fit and athletically well now, I was sort of an ugly duckling growing up and had difficulty. I got recycled, and even the instructor that got me wasn't getting there. He went to an older instructor who'd flown in Korea and asked him if he'd take me. Mm-hmm. And he did, and under his tutelage, I blossomed. Towards the end of hovering, he literally got me to do something that most pilots can't do. And because what you need to work on is what's difficult for you, what you don't do well. Human nature is you practice the things you're good at, but that's not what you should be practicing. Mm-hmm. So he got me out and he'd get me on the runway, and they have a line painted down the middle of the runway. And he'd want me to hover down that runway at a steady pace. Then he wanted me to start turning the aircraft around while I'm going down that line, keeping the same movement down that line. Now, it doesn't sound too bad. I mean, we're sitting here talking about it. It doesn't sound too shabby, but you got a wind to contend with. So it means as you bring your tail rotor around into the wind, you have to be applying pedal to that. The minute you get past a certain point, you're not putting pedal to it anymore. You got to put the other pedal because the wind's going to now try and push you. So that's one thing. Secondly, when you're pulling into the wind, you have to pull more power on, so you I'm doing it without even thinking about it. You're twisting the throttle because you run it, the engine's got to run at the same RPM all the time. Well, you're pulling more power, so you have to wrap throttle on. The minute the wind's blowing it, you have to wrap throttle off. And while you're going around like this, it's interesting because your perspective changes, and the cyclic stick here that's controlling my direction, if I'm just going down facing it, it's like this. But as I'm going down that line, the stick's basically going around the cockpit entirely to keep me on that line and keep me moving at a steady speed down it. So it was different. He made me sweat a bit more in the cockpit than most, and I know for a fact most of the pilots I dealt with later never did it. I mean, we get some of them in the aircraft, and I'm saying, well, try this. You're crazy. Well, go ahead and try it. And they can't do it, and they're all over the place. And I became a better pilot because I was recycled and that I was having a hard time with it. And at that time, almost all the pilots we had that were teaching at Mineral Wells were all civilian. They were all ex-military for the most part, but they're all civilian. And the gentleman that I had, and I remember the most, like I said, was a Korean pilot, and he'd flown the OH-13s there. And the OH-13s were old aircraft, and they were underpowered. And so a lot of things he had me do, he wouldn't let me do a normal takeoff. He made me do what they called a max performance takeoff. And if a helicopter moves forward, helicopters just don't take off. If you move forward, when you get 17 knots of relative air over the blades, it'll start climbing out at 500 feet a minute on its own. You don't need to give it any more power. Sometimes you need to reduce a little power. But it'll actually get that much lift, and it'll start climbing out all on its own. He had me do stuff like that, all kinds of things, because the aircraft was underpowered. And 13 was the most underpowered of all the 3 aircraft they had there. The 55, it had power. I mean, you could hot dog that thing all day long. I'm not sure that's teaching you good technique. But he put me through the mill, and as a result, I was a much better pilot.
Okay. Now that's still at Mineral Wells that this is going on? Okay. But that's not the end of your training, though?
No. Down there, you learn basic flight maneuvers. You learn, like we were talking about hovering, you learn how to take off, you learn how to land, you learn max performance takeoffs, you learn emergency procedures, how to land it without an engine, how to handle tail rotor failures. You go through all that basic type of stuff. Then they start doing cross country, and that gets kind of interesting. You get to do that solo, and that was an interesting story. They had us check what we wanted for lunch or dinner that night, because you're going to do a night cross country, and you get to check on your little form what you want, and they had a pork chop sandwich down there, and I checked it. And I'm alone in this aircraft, and I'm doing this formation flying, and I go in my bag and get my pork chop sandwich, unwrap it, and take a bite, and it was a real pork chop sandwich, bone and all. So you get all kinds of surprises. I mean, it's
Okay. All right. Now you have the Mineral Wells, and then after that is Fort Rucker next?
Fort Rucker, Alabama.
Okay.
I don't remember if the first was 4 months or 5 months, and then we went to the other school. In the other school, they started off, we were flying OH-13S models, which are supercharged, brand new. These things were fully instrument rated. They never bothered to teach us to fly the dumb thing. We got in it, the instructor took it off, we put a hood on our head, and we never saw where we were going. We're looking at our flight charts, we're looking at the instruments, and this is all analog, which means that these are all instruments with little dials and a little needle pointing. This is not the modern day stuff where I'm looking at a GPS with a map and the little planes right here on this course, and none of that kind of thing. You tune in a radio wave, you fly along that radio wave so many minutes at this speed, figuring the winds, and you ought to be at this location. You ain't looking at your little screen and saying, oh, there's my little airplane, I'm right there. Oh, no, 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 no. And if you keep flying off the radio, you start recomputing and figure out what the wind actually is, and it's never what they forecast. It's got a habit of changing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you noticed that, but it changes. So you get out your little whiz wheel, little circular computer, and you recalculate, and then you reset your heading, and you refly it, and you recalculate your time to be at your location, and you did instrument school. Then after that, they started transitioning us into the Huey, UH-1s, and there were Alpha Bravos, Charlies, and Deltas, and then hotel models, and we got shuffled through all of them. And the hotel model was the major one that was flown in Vietnam. Charlie, Alpha and Bravos were all changed to Charlie models, and Charlie models in Vietnam were predominantly used for gunships until the Cobra came along. And I happened to be there when the first of the Cobras showed up in Vietnam, which was interesting. But then with the Hueys, once you're transitioned into them, then they started teaching us formation flying and different things. I mean, it's got different characteristics, so while you may have learned how to do an auto rotation, now you're doing one with a Huey. And Huey was basically a 3/4 ton truck, and really nice. You land it without an engine. It's got weighted blades, and it's used to having a load, and you could literally pick it up and hover it down the runway for a while and set it back on the runway because you had that kind of rotor speed left.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot more fun than flying some of the other aircraft, but it was total different feel. Huey, when you come off the ground, you really feel the nose come up first, and then the other backside comes up, and the rear right stays on the ground to the last moment. Then you pick it. So you're literally, if you can't hover now, you're in trouble. Because like I said, she starts lifting front first, and then one of the back heels will come off, and you're literally sitting on just one point in the back. You don't want to try coasting that way. You don't want to try backing up. You better be staying right where you are. And if the wind's moving 15 miles an hour, it means as you're coming up, you're literally flying 15 miles an hour if you're staying in one place.
All right. Now, warrant officers who flew helicopters in Vietnam have kind of a general reputation of being kind of a wild bunch of characters. What sort of men were you training with as you were going through the flight schools?
I don't know. You don't think about it.
Okay.
You know, we were definitely an ingenuitive bunch. I mean, you kind of had to be to stay ahead of the TAC officers and everything that's going on. And let me tell you a different story. When I came home from Vietnam, between tours, because I extended to stay. It was a hardship tour, and they couldn't make you stay more than a year. When I got back, I went down to the airport, and I threw $5 down on the table, and Cessna had an introductory ride. Took you up for an hour and a half for $5. And I went down, threw down my $5. And we're walking out to the aircraft with the instructor, and I told him, by the way, don't tell me it's an attitude indicator. Don't tell me this is an ILS and a GCA. I know. I just want to kick the tire, light the fire, and burn a hole in the sky. He says, what are you flying? And I told him. So I went out and I flew. We come back in and he says, 1 more hour of dual time. You can do the rest as solo. I'll sign you off. And I go, no. He says, why? Baby's a homesick brick looking for a place to bury itself. There's so much difference between flying a helicopter and flying a fixed wing. A fixed wing will do something for you. I mean, you can trim out everything and it'll just maintain. It's like throwing a paper airplane. It'll fly. Helicopter won't do anything. And I think it takes somebody loosely wrapped to fly them and maintain them. And I believe it was Paul Harvey who says that a pilot's job was to keep 2,000 parts flying in formation. If you literally get into aerodynamics, you find out we got counterbalance weights up there and everything else, and the whole thing's kind of by centrifugal force kind of trying to tear itself apart, and it doesn't want to do anything it's supposed to do. And I think it really takes someone that's kind of loose wired. If you're too stiff or too uptight or whatever, I don't think you're gonna make it. I don't know for sure, but I just don't think so. And Catch-22 and watching all the rest of the movies, I gather the World War II pilots weren't any better. Except there were just more of us in Vietnam.
All right. So I'm going to go back here to, roughly when do you finish flight school then? Or when do you get to Vietnam, I guess, is there
Well,
any?
funny thing's the way it works out. By the time I get through flight school, I got 2 years in the service.
Mm-hmm.
But when I signed up for flight school, I had to agree to fly for 3 years after, or
Mhm.
have 1 year commitment
Right.
after flight school if I didn't make it, if I washed out.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get through with flight school, you have a 3-year obligation. 1 year is going to be Vietnam. 1 year is going to be training replacements. And then you're going to be back to Vietnam, because it was a hardship tour. It wasn't a declared war.
Mm-hmm.
If it was a declared war, they were afraid to make a declared war. We haven't had a declared war since World War II. Everything has been a police action or one thing or another. Congress needs to declare war. They're afraid to give the president the War Powers Act and his dictatorial type of powers. So we have not had a declared war. Vietnam was not a declared war. So they could only make you stay there a year. And that made it quite difficult for all the Vietnam vets, because we went over, we joined a unit that was there, we took the place of somebody that was leaving, we stayed a year, and then we left and went home alone. We didn't go home with the guys we were serving with. Our type of service was quite different. I mean, my dad, my stepdad, he trained with guys from Muskegon. He went over to Europe, landed D4, D+4, 4 days after D-Day, walked all the way to Berlin. They came home together on a boat, had weeks decompressing and talking with each other, knew the people in the community, joined the same VFWs and American Foreign Legions and all that stuff. They knew each other. And you form a type of camaraderie in the military that's nowhere else. Nowhere else. And we went over solo. We came back solo. Remember, we came back real fast. I mean, you board the plane, 24 hours, you're back in the States. Whatever time it takes you to go stand by to get home, and you're dumped home. And when I got off the plane, they were literally carrying the posters and hollering "Baby Killer" and spitting at us, and it was different. Mm-hmm. And the guy next door could have been in Vietnam and got home the day before you got home. You wouldn't know it. You weren't saying anything about it because it wasn't that popular. In my wife's family, her brother served 2 tours in Vietnam and was an advisor with the Vietnamese on his 2nd tour. And his sister was demonstrating downtown Chicago against the war. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't uncommon to have families split like that. In World War II, wasn't that way. Mm-hmm. And we didn't even get support from the VFW and the Foreign Legions and stuff like that. I mean, it was...
All right. Going to go back again here. So you finish flight school.
Yep.
Do you get to leave home before you go overseas, or do they just send you away?
Well, they intended me to. Didn't turn out that way. I have a series of allergies. So when you go through to get the shots, and of course, the military is famous for giving shots, and you get in line, you go through to get your shots, they'll list a series of allergies. If you had any of them, you put your hat on backwards. So put my hat on backwards and go through the line. So when I was all through with school, I got these orders to go to Vietnam right away. So I already know there's a whole bunch of shots I didn't have. So I asked. So then they go check my records, and they go, "We don't know. You don't know." Well, okay, so now what do I do? Well, you're not going anywhere. Your orders are null and void. Now, a training base doesn't know what to do with you after you're through training. So I'm put on temporary duty, or TDY, and I'm an officer. So I can go get a room in the BOQ, but I'm also being paid temporary duty pay, and I'm going, wait a minute, I don't have any assignment? Nope. I don't have any duty? Nope. So I went down to Panama City, Florida, got a room at the Holiday Inn on the beach. And every day at noon, I call the first sergeant, and got any orders yet? Oh, breaks my heart. Okay, I'll call you tomorrow. And I'm off and playing. And that went on for, I don't know, 2-3 weeks. Finally, they got orders for me. But my orders aren't specific now. before they knew they had this many pilots going to be coming to Vietnam. So they already have a place you're going, and they're already expecting you. They sent me over to basically a manpower pool. And I got thinking about it. I flew into Cam Ranh Bay. They sent me over to this manpower pool, and they sent me over to 1st Field Force Vietnam, largest advisory command in Vietnam. They sent me over to 1st Field Force Artillery. You know, my mind's going, is this aggressive negotiations? What's advisory doing with artillery? Didn't ask anything, just do what you're supposed to do. They sent me to 52nd Artillery Group headquarters located in Pleiku. Now, Pleiku is 2/3 of the way up South Vietnam, and it's dead center in the middle of the country. East to west is dead center, 2/3 of the way north. Right in the middle of I-Corps, or 2 Corps. I get up there, and CIA's got a road office across the road. 5th Special Forces a 1/4 mile down the road. We have a lot of big guns, 175s, 8-inch. They're not even in the military anymore. They've been replaced with rockets now. And these guns were placed in Special Forces camps all up and down the border. Now, when I say border, this is Laos and Cambodia. And they have a sprinkling of light guns, 155s and 105s. What I mean by sprinkling is they don't have a full battery of guns there. They have 2, maybe 3, maybe 1. And the gun is there to fire mutual support on the other Special Forces camp further down the border. The Montagnards were an Aboriginal people that prior to World War II were pretty well left alone in the highlands. Up in the mountains there, the Vietnamese didn't go. They stayed down on the delta, raised their rice on the coastal plains, and they weren't up in the delta to speak of. Due to the Japanese being there, nice place to hide is in the jungle. Hiding in a rice paddy ain't a good idea. So they were more of them in the highlands. And the Montagnards were up there, and they were an Aboriginal people. And when you go into a village, you could tell if the chaplains had got to them or if the missionaries had been there, because then the women's were wearing tops. Otherwise, they had a cloth wrapped around their waist. The guys wore a breechcloth, and that was about it. About the only thing man-made they had was maybe a machete that came from outside their village, but they had a unique machete too that their village people would make, very unique. They were the Indians, the natives of the country, if you will. Fine light infantry. I mean, we put them in over the border. Well, I can't say we did that. I know officially from the radio and the TV, we have no combat troops in Laos and Cambodia. So they got over the border somehow, and they were there doing their patrols and things. And it wasn't unusual. We'd lose radio contact with them. And they were being controlled by Special Forces and CIA. And sometimes a month, 2 months later, they'd come back across the border. Now, they went over the border. Special Forces contracted out of Hong Kong and other places to have special uniforms made. And you remember the Tiger Stripes were a uniform connected with Vietnam. But they were never issued to our troops. They were uniforms that were made for the Special Forces, because the Montagnards were smaller framed little people. And our uniforms didn't fit them. They made special rations for them, because our sea rations were too big and stuff they didn't eat. So they made special sea rations for them, stuff. They had special packs built for them and everything else. They'd put them across the border, and when they came back, after we'd lost contact with them, they came back wearing black pajamas, toting AK-47s, socks with rice balls in them hung around their necks. They literally were in their own world in the jungle. They could have, if they decided not to be soldiers yet, take their machete and live off the jungle, because that's where they lived. But they carried the war to the enemy yet and came back across the border totally resupplied with the enemy's supplies, and were terrific troops. But since they were Montagnards and they were Aboriginal people, they had a hard time figuring out how to fire a cannon to shoot at something they couldn't see. So we had the guns there for mutual support. We also had guns in a number of other places. We supported 1st Cav, we supported 4th Infantry Division. We had guns that were used for hip shoots. Hip shoot was, they'd run a unit down the road, and at some place they'd just pull off the road, haul out their own barbed wire and put it around, make a base right on the side of the road, and that'd kind of keep the Viet Cong off guard, because now you could put a pin in the map and draw a brand new circle and say, what couldn't they support with artillery before they can support now? Why did they move these guns? What are they doing? And they do hip shoots. We did all kinds of things. We even had a few big guns, and I don't know why, down at Phu Cat, which is close to Quy Nhon, down in the South China Sea. So I flew everywhere from the South China Sea to the border. 2 weeks in Vietnam, the old man tells me to grab my dress blues. He wants me to fly him down to Saigon for a command party. So I mean, I was from Saigon all the way up into about half of I Corps, from South China Sea. Well, we have a radio in the aircraft, they call it a transponder. And transponder puts a coded signal on a radar screen telling them it's you. And if you get into trouble, you flip a switch, and it literally does ripples like on a pond on somebody's radar screen. And they know you're in trouble, and they got your exact location. They set my transponder so I could enter Thailand because it was shorter than coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And they told me, if I get in trouble, keep going, because your nature is to go where you know. So if you get lost, you backtrack, right? And they said, nah, you get in trouble, you have mechanical difficulties, whatever, keep going. They'll recognize you as friendly. You can enter Thailand. So I don't know where I officially know where I wasn't,
mm-hmm.
but I don't know where I was.
Right. Okay. When you joined the unit, did they know what to do with you?
Yeah, I'm a pilot. I'm
Mhm.
coming, but they couldn't use me. Well, first off, when I get there, they can't use you at all, because you take a week to 2 weeks to get climatized. And just like in basic and some of the other places, we were down south, we were in a hot, muggy environment, we were doing more physical activity than normal. But Vietnam's even different. My wife always wants me to tell that when the C-130 landed in Pleiku and it taxied up on the tarmac by the terminal, when you walk down the ramp in the back, you step out on that tarmac, that's like an asphalt paved area. It was like walking into an oven. And you're smelling the incense and the nuke mom, the fish sauce. You know you ain't in Kansas anymore, Toto. I mean, it hits you. I mean, it's stark reality. It's here. This is different. Well, for the first week or two, they want you to climatize. You're getting salt tablets every time you go down the meal. They're making sure you get them. We started taking chloroquine, primaquine, and dapsone, which are anti-malaria drugs, suppressant drugs. I got to get a physical. I got to be assigned a weapon. I got to be assigned my flight suits. And you'd think I'd come with that stuff. I came with my helmet.
Mm-hmm.
But all the rest stuff, and they issued me 4 pair of jungle fatigues. I don't know what for. But they also issued me a pup tent, a full pup tent, a regular duffel bag, ground pad, TA-250 gear, which is your web gear with your ammo pouches and your first aid kit and your butt pack and all that stuff. And I actually signed for an extra duffel bag. Stuffed all that junk in a duffel bag because I ain't gonna be using it. And it went in my room and went underneath the bunk. But everybody gets it.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to go through all that sort of stuff. Then when I go down to the aviation section, we didn't have Hueys. They had OH-23s and OH-6s. I didn't fly an OH-23 in flight school. OH-6s were a more advanced aircraft by Hughes, and a lot of guys know it as the Loach, light observation
Mm-hmm.
helicopter. That was more fun to fly, so they didn't want to train me to fly that. So I sat around another week while they sent another pilot to go through instructor school, and he come back, and they trained me to fly a 23, which was another one of the basic ones.
Mm-hmm.
and I flew a 23, and for a number of months I flew a 23. Then our unit got totally replaced with OH-58s. And when the OH-58s come in, I went down to Vung Tau, which is a little south of Pleiku, Saigon, and got transitioned into the OH-58. And that was done by, again, civilian pilots that were on contract to Bell. And, but that was interesting because Vung Tau is a different place. All the way through the entire war, even when the French were there, they never fought in Vung Tau. And Vung Tau had a reputation for being an R&R center, a rest and relaxation center, for both the Vietnamese, North and South, the Americans and the French. And you walk down the streets there and you got these huge stone walls, brick walls, with the broken glass on the top of it. And some of the glass is all different colors. Mm-hmm. And then wrought iron gates to go into these fabulous houses and mansions and places. And they took me, and first thing they did is take my gun away. So they take my gun, they give me a card. That's never happened before. And they take me down to this hotel. And again, great big walls, iron gates, and there's two great big sandbag bunkers at the corner of the, and that didn't surprise me. But what surprised me as I got close is there's all these cobwebs in the shooting loops. And I'm, what? And I go into this hotel, and typical old French hotel, wide open first floor. You got the hotel desk, you got dance floor, you got a bar, you got the restaurant, and then it's the typical open type of elevator with the, I don't know what you want to call it, the accordion type of door that goes across. Mm-hmm. And you go up, and they took me up to my room, and really nice room. I mean, big bed, big mosquito net goes around the whole bed. The room's got a couch in it, and a chair, and a table, and bath. But interesting thing about the bath is it was tempered water, but no hot water. You had a veranda or a porch that was off the side that was all screened in. Just beautiful place, but there's no bunker. And the base I was on, we were getting hit 2-3 times a week. And we'd scramble the aircraft, so I had my gun all the time. And I'm down here, and there's no bunker. And then they tell me the city's on limits all night. Well, where I come from, at dark, or before dark, they close the gates to the base. They haul out a bunch of look like sawhorses. They got concertina wire all over them. They put them in the driveway and that, and everything's closed up. And if you're going to go anywhere after that, you need orders, and you need at least 2 vehicles, and you needed a machine gun and a radio, and you had to have your flak jacket on and your helmet, and the town's on limits? I literally had to go downtown to see. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And they literally had part of the market still set up where all the fish are all displayed, and the fruit's all laid out, and I would, and we're in the same country. I mean, it was, whoa, just really different.
Okay, so that's sort of the exceptional experience. Let's go back. When you were flying the first part of that tour, when you're flying the 23s, what kind of missions did you have?
Missions stayed the same all the way through. The group had a table of organization equipment, TONE, that prior to about 6 months or so before I got there, they had fixed wings, L-19 bird dogs, which was common for artillery units to have fixed wings. Mm-hmm. And they switched them over to helicopters. And they were authorized 2 aircraft, 2 pilots, 2 mechanics, and 2 toolboxes per battalion. And group was authorized 4. And they put them all together and decided they had an aviation company. Now that sounds nice, but we don't have anybody to run operations. Mm-hmm. We don't have the radio to run the airfield. We don't have a whole bunch of stuff. So we were this kind of put together, you know, war's a come-as-you-are affair. Everybody's got an idea of how it ought to be fought, and everybody's got this great idea of how many men ought to be in a platoon. But you fight, you go to war with what you have. So they had the 23s and the OH-6s that were here because the bird dogs were gone. And OH-23, you straddle the instrument panel, and there's a place for a person here and a person here. And that's fine. If I'm flying the commander out and he wants to go inspect someplace, I got the commander. He wants to bring somebody with him, that's fine. He can come with me. If I'm flying the chaplains, there's 2 chaplains. If I'm flying, US OSHO usually went in the OH-6s or the Hueys. We we submitted up above somewhere, and we requisitioned 1 Huey, and usually 1, 2, rare day we might have 3 heavy lift aircraft, flying cranes or Chinooks, because we had some bases that were so isolated, like Fire Base 6. They brought in a bulldozer, leveled off the top of the mountain, brought in the barbed wire and put in the perimeter, built the bunkers there, and we literally landed on a bunker. There was an H in sandbags put on top of this bunker. You landed on top of the bunker at Fire Base 6. There was no gate, there was no there was no road coming in there, there was no paths going out of there. It was just there. So everything they had went in and out by air. So there would be a water tanker at the end of our field. They'd pick up that water trailer and carry it out to Fire Base 6. We had a lot of stuff went out by air. Of course, Vietnam, one of the trouble the French made is they limited themselves to the road, and the Viet Cong took control of everything else, the jungle, the small villages, everything. And then during the monsoon season, a lot of those roads were totally impassable. So the helicopter became airborne, like I said, airborne truck. And I was flying the light pickup. And they'd put in that 23 whatever they wanted to go. There were times when all I carried was mail bags and carried mail out to these bases. And I'd go to this base and drop off a bag, and I'd go to this base and drop off a bag. I might take the, Doc might go out there and check the mess hall. If they didn't have a mess hall, he might go out there and check their water. He might go out and check where the latrines are and how things looked, and just do a sick call out there, just see how things are in general. There were all kinds of things that had to go, such as people that had to repair a gun because guns malfunction, the recoil mechanisms on them are hydraulic, they fail. The 175s were notorious. They were a high velocity long barrel gun. They only fired so many rounds, barrels had to be replaced. So all that stuff got out there and got back by aircraft. So 23s, they got utilized. I might go out by myself and register a gun battery. Technically, a gun ought to fire from here to there and hit a certain spot, and they know by math that ought to do that. But that's theoretical, and in a real world, it doesn't do that. So you'd have to register the gun battery every so often, and you'd have a known point, and they'd shoot at it, and I'd correct the artillery till they hit it. And then they could make a correction for barrel wear and for weather and for who knows what all with their slide rules and computers to figure out exactly what we're going to fire. So then the next rounds were accurate. So every so often, the guns had to be registered. And I'd go out and do that. And I do that by myself. Well, yes and no. Our crew chiefs didn't fly. Now, if I was flying a Huey, your crew chief was your door gunner. But we didn't have the space for them. So our crew chiefs didn't generally fly. So if I was going out to register a gun battery, I'd tell my crew chief, you want to go? Yep. And those light aircraft had dual controls. We usually took them out. He'd put them in, and I'd let them have some stick time and try and fly it. And you let them call the base and use the radio and learn the radio procedures. And you never know. I may go out sometime and be covering a convoy with the crew chief, and I may get shot up, and he may have to fly it back. So while we weren't supposed to, we did.
All right. How common was it for you to be in a place where somebody might shoot at you when you're in the air?
Real common. Our base, we had what was known as a one-eyed Charlie. One-eyed Charlie was a person that the Viet Cong would press into service, give some dilapidated type of gun, give him a few rounds and tell him shoot at the Americans. He didn't want to, but if he didn't, they'd come back at night and hurt him, hurt his family, hurt whatever. They would quite often then tell him that if he'd go down by the bridge, by the creek, out by his field, there's a little tin can sitting underneath the bridge. There's 2 rounds in that can. He used to put his 2 empties in there. And he had to put his 2 empties in there and shoot his 2 rounds at us. And if you had a one-eyed Charlie, you didn't shoot back at him. I mean, he didn't want to shoot at you. So he just gun over the barrack, over the berm, you know, bang, bang, and he'd be gone. And ours only hit 1 aircraft once, all the while I was there. But you knew he was going to shoot at you sometime or other. Mm-hmm. And he usually shot at us rather than other things. And so you didn't return fire. One night, we got hit. I scrambled, got down, got the aircraft, took off. And helicopter doesn't really have to take off into the wind. We do for some safety procedures, but it's pretty well making its own wind. It doesn't much matter. And I took off into the wind down the runway, and as I got to the end of the runway, and I'm getting ready to go over the bunker line, and then the barbed wire starts, out on the rice paddies out there, all of a sudden there went this solid wall of tracers in front of me. And a helicopter is basically a flying disc. The fuselage underneath is just airstream going along for the ride. So I did a pedal turn, which means I just made the back end of the helicopter go to the front end. Now I'm basically going backwards. And I turned and I just did a pedal turn and just went the other way down the runway. You can't do that with a fixed wing. If I'd have been a fixed wing, I'd have been committed. Probably should have been anyway for different reasons. But anyway, I went the other way down the runway. And then the OH-23 had tube radios. So I can't even tell anybody yet because you turn on tubes and you got to wait for them to warm up. And I scrambled, so they ain't even working yet. So by the time I'm clearing the runway on the other side, I'm screaming back at the guys, hey, tell everybody that gets an aircraft not to go off that end of the runway. But we got shot at. You know, it's not always in the same place. It's not always the same way. It's not always. I was covering a convoy one day and they got hit, and I'm readjusting. Down the highways, quite often they would park tanks as part of the road security. Mm-hmm. And I was repositioning the tanks and directing their fire. I was also calling fire from one of our fire bases in. In the meantime, I went on guard frequency and requested any fast movers going back with ordnance. I'm guiding them in and having them drop ordnance along the top of the ridge line so that the Viet Cong couldn't escape over the top of the hill. While I'm doing all that, the captain that is liaison for me with the convoy calls me and tells me I got tracers going by my tail boom. All right. I mean, what are you going to do? We flew at 1,000 feet above ground level, AGL, because at that place, ground fire wasn't effective from small arms because you're outside of effective range. And you were real close that most anti-aircraft fire doesn't want to shoot at you because you're real close. And if they fired at us and missed us the first time, we'd kick it out of trim, drop all our pitch, and be on the tree line before they could get a second burst at us. So we flew around at about 1,000 feet above the ground, and if it's missing me, that's good. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't go across the road because that's where I'm directing all the other fire. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything about it. You just sit there and do your job. I mean, they used to say we were real cool. That we had, well, that we just had nerves of ice, and it's not true. You got to fly the aircraft. If you don't fly the aircraft, it's going to crash. It will not maintain forward flight. It won't do anything on its own. You just got to do. So while we may look calm and we may look whatever, tain't so.
All right. Now, did the helicopters you fly, did they ever get hit?
I never got a bullet hole. I did a tour and a half. I did that for an early release from service, but I never got a bullet hole. 2 of them, I got so slow and low in doing the job that had to be done that they got so full of shrapnel, they wouldn't even look at replacing it. They just gave me another aircraft, and I found out later they stripped the components out of both of those airframes and scrapped the airframe.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, they got hit. I was once, when we got the OH-58s, we had the Bell tech rep living with us because they were so new. We had 13 of the 20 of them that came to Vietnam in our unit.
Mm-hmm.
Self-centering bearings didn't. Self-lubricating bearings didn't. Of course, since they're self-lubricating, you don't put zert fittings on there, and you don't put the little nuts you can take off, put zert fitting in there. And so what are you going to do with them? We had a lot of interesting times to start with them because while the Army had accepted them yet, that none of them had seen combat, none of them had been in those kind of environments, and we were working out stuff brand new. Forgot what I was going to tell you.
Well, we were talking about being hit and damage or things like that. And did you have accidents with those helicopters or close calls with them while you were learning how to fly them?
I had 2 guys in my unit that cracked them up. One was with an 086. 086 had a unique character. Every aircraft has a little something about them that's different. 086, if you hover downwind, downwind, upwind, I wasn't ever checked out in one. The tail rotor would disturb the air enough in that configuration that the tail rotor, the main rotor, would disturb the tail rotor enough that it would lose integrity. And while he was going over the barbed wire, he thought he had a tail rotor failure. And in a tail rotor failure, you're supposed to chop the throttle and then dead stick it in. Well, he dead sticked it in the barbed wire, skids caught, he rolled it up. He got medevaced out of country. Alive, doing fine, but we had another one who was going to impress people. The aircraft set up with enough other connections that you can put headsets on and headphones, and if you want to, you can give everybody in the aircraft a set of headphones. You can talk to them on intercom. And they were questioning about auto rotation, so he chopped the throttle and was bringing it in for an engine off landing. And when he got down, I guess around 500 feet, he rolled the throttle back on, except the engine had quit. But he went through the procedure, turned the throttle back on, but he obviously wasn't watching the instruments, and he went to pull pitch, and his rotor blades slowed down even further. So now he's low and slow and no rotor RPM, and he's committed. It's a very forgiving aircraft. He decided to try and make a running landing instead of trying to flare, and found a rice paddy dike and took his skids off the bottom, and that broke all the tubes that controlled the aircraft. From there on in, he was going along for the ride instead of flying it. And I have pictures of that aircraft. The main body of the aircraft fuselage basically broken in half, stayed together and landed down there, but it got busted up. He ended up with a spinal compression. I was flying, I know what I was going to tell you. Our OH-58s were so new that nothing really worked the way it was supposed to. And when it didn't, pilots like to fly. I mean, we got into it for a reason. We don't like war, but we like flying. So we'd go and fly with some of the lift units, some of the Huey units. And I was flying with the Huey unit, and we were going down the Idrang Valley, and I was in flight lead, which means that if you have a V, I'm the head goose in the V flying down there. And all of a sudden on the radio, there's all kinds of chatter. Chalk 2's going, Chalk 3's breaking off, Chalk 4's going overhead, Chalk 5's going low. What's going on? We're getting raked with 50 caliber fire. The only aircraft didn't get hit. Over the border one time, went into an LZ, the only aircraft to come back out. I don't know. I got a guardian angel with ulcers.
Something.
owe him an apology someday.
Okay.
But you do the job. And while the aircraft got banged up and cracked up and shot up, the death rate, the injury rate, the Army lost more pilots in 1 year. I mentioned we had 3-year obligation. 1 year was Vietnam, 1 year was back to state training, then back to Vietnam. They lost more pilots in 1 year in the States due to motorcycles and cars, alcohol, motorcycles and cars, than they did in 2 years of combat flying. So you talk about us being loose-wired and crazy, but I guess.
Yeah. Well, you were maybe a little bit less so in the sense that you had religious motivations that made you maybe behave better than some of your colleagues. I actually wanted to kind of transition a little bit over into talking about sort of life on the base in Pleiku. Daily life, what was that like? What would you do day to day?
Well, most of the time I was there, I was the executive officer of the aviation unit, so I got up early in the morning. I'd go to the mess hall and eat. Then I'd go on up and sit in the old man's briefing. Commanding officer didn't care to do that. So I'm sitting in a full bird colonel, group headquarters. I'm sitting in his briefing, so I'm hearing everything going on all over Vietnam, listen to all the latest intelligence reports, everything else. And I have to report how many aircraft we have available today, how many hours of blade time we have available. He's telling me that they have guns down at, say, Firebase 6 and Ben Het, and we've got to get a mechanic out there to fix those. That got priority. Stuff like that. So after that's over, I'm going down to the base, and we finally got a sergeant who's nothing to do with aviation, doesn't know anything about it. But we got a staff sergeant, E6, and he ran our operation for us and took care of paperwork. And you'd come into our building down there, and he'd have a whiteboard, and he'd have all the bases, and you'd tell him where you want to go. He'd write you on the board, and if we had a seat somewhere, he'd put you in the seat, because we had this Huey that we got every day. The Chinooks and Cranes and that were always doing sling loads, so they weren't taking anybody. And then we had all the other aircraft, the OH-6s, OH-58s, 23s. We had an extra seat, put you in there, take you out to the base, and he was taking care of stuff like that. He also did flight following for us. So if I'm leaving the base, going to Pleiku before I land at Pleiku, I call him, tell him I'm over Pleiku, mark me down, and he'd flight follow and keep track of us. Things like that. And then I went to work. But our unit, since it was different, they just figured they had so many aircraft. And when a full bird colonel tells a battalion commander what he's going to do, he says, "Yes, sir." So all the aircraft were put in this pool. And while a battalion commander may want a particular pilot, and he may say, "I need an aircraft today," he got an aircraft today. And there was no argument, no nothing. You make sure he got an aircraft today. And he'd fly and go where he wanted to go. So the group commander decided early I was his pilot. I was a warrant. That meant I had to stay at flight school. I wasn't partying every night. He didn't want a hard bar. I was in my mid-20s. He wanted one that was married. I was single. I was the oldest warrant, which also helped maybe settle me down a little bit. The old man hoped so anyway. So I became his pilot. So if he wanted to go somewhere, I was reserved for him. And I waited till he'd come down and I flew him. But then I'd fly whatever he put high priority to. There was one time I flew a kid that had to repair a bulldozer. I was over there during what they called the Vietnamization section, where we were training Vietnam to take over more of the war. And we were destroying some of the bases, and a bulldozer was broke. So I flew this kid out to repair the bulldozer, and the old man said he never flew before. He's scared to death to fly. He flew here in the Big Bird, but he's scared to fly. So he said, "I want you to take him." And I did. And that was a lot of fun. Matter of fact, I got him so relaxed, I let him fly the aircraft part of the way. And when he was through repairing the bulldozer, he says, "Here, you drive the bulldozer." And I says, "I don't know a thing about a bulldozer." He says, we're tearing the base down. You ain't got anything you can hurt. So I literally went right through a building with a bulldozer. But, you know, it's not all war. Crazy part about war most people don't understand, and you ask me about my day, is that a lot of it's hurry up and wait, always. And I can remember after I'd been there, I don't know, about 4 or 5 months, something like that. When I first got there, we were getting hit 2, 3, 4 times a week. And by 4th, 5th month I was there, we might get hit once and then not get hit for a couple weeks. And we were sitting around one night thinking about how many people had transitioned in, how many new people we had, what would they do if we got hit, because you're not dealing with old people that been through this mill. And we were talking about the old days when we scrambled with a shower shoes and a towel wrapped around us because we happened to be in the shower. And you know, common to Hollywood, you don't run back to your room and jump in your flight suit and put your socks on and put your boots on, and you know, you don't do that. I mean, we'd get airborne, and then we're talking to each other on the radio because we had a series of aircraft at our field. We'd be talking to everybody on the air once we got airborne, and who's got an aircraft with time? Okay, and who's in full uniform? And then the rest of us would go over to another base and sit on the runway and wait till this thing was over. And you know, if you happen to be in full uniform, you were at the O Club and you were in full uniform, fine. If I was in shower shoes and sandals, I'm probably sitting over at Pleiku Air Base or over at Camp Holloway on the other side of town, waiting for the battle at our base to end. And then I'll come back. And it was funny, it was just a couple days later. I ended up sitting over at Camp Holloway in a towel and flip-flops. And nothing looks funnier than a pilot with a helmet on, gloves on, chicken plate, survival vest, a Roman-type towel wrapped around your waist and flip-flops. I mean, bare arms, you know, just... And you get a lot of comments from ground crews running around on the base doing their thing, you know.
Okay. So now what would you be hit with? Was it rockets or mortars or?
Rockets, mortars, we got probed. Second week I was in Vietnam, they shot our barber in the barbed wire. He was sneaking in with satchel charges and not much more than a loincloth wrapped around his waist, and which is another interesting story because I ended up flying a Kit Carson Scout. They started, shortly before I got to Vietnam, something called Chu Hoi Project, which I gather means surrender or something similar to that in Vietnamese, but Chu Hoi. And they would come over, and most of the guys that Chu Hoi'd were put back in the military, but they're put back in the South Vietnamese military. And they knew if they got caught, life wasn't going to be good for them. So they ended up being, by and large, the vast percentage of them, ended up being very, very loyal and very, very good soldiers. And we had one that was a sapper. And I flew him with a commander at times out to some of these bases. And he'd take a look at the base. And he'd literally strip down to his underwear, and he'd get a couple little pieces of bamboo sticks and put them in his, and he'd come through the barbed wire. And he'd come through the barbed wire about as fast as you think you could walk through it. And he'd show them where their weak points were and where stuff was bad and stuff like that. And that was a real eye-opener in eyesight because, well, the commander would see him at this base. We had 4 and 5 battalions, and each battalion's got 4 or 5 gun batteries, or 4 or 5 companies with 4 or 5 gun batteries in each company. And so there's a lot of bases out there. And I got to fly a lot of them and a lot of different commanders, not only the group commander, but a lot of the battalion commanders and stuff like that. And so I took this little Kit Carson Scout to several different bases and stuff. And it was interesting. It was interesting talking with them and finding out a bit about how they lived and how the Viet Cong fought and things and different. Wife mentioned that I hadn't commented about, there was a hip shoot position out one time, and in the middle of the night, they thought they had movement in the barbed wire. So they put a couple flares up, and there's nobody. Of course, you can hear the mortar fire of the flare. So this went on, and there's some more movement, and so they put 2 flares up, but one with a delay fuse and one with a short burn. So you fire the flares, but one lights, it goes out quick, short pause, and another one lights. Here's a Viet Cong standing in the barbed wire, right in front of a Duster, 40 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. And this thing had been mounted on tracks and was part of the perimeter support for this hip shoot. And they shot him. So the next day they make your intelligence report and stuff, and a few days later they're making a sweep through the area. And I'm sitting in the old man's briefing every morning. They found where the guy had left his clothes and his pack and got his journal. And he had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail with a whole bunch of sappers. And there were like 2 or 3 guys left with him, and he that's all that was left. And these guys were low morale, and he was going to teach them how to do this to get them around. He was a lieutenant. And I don't know what happened to the other 2, but they didn't attack the perimeter. I think they just decided the war was too much and quit. But interesting sidelight that, you know, as I look at the stuff we went through and what I was trained for, I can't imagine what it was like being on the other side. Down by Saigon, they found some places underground that were whole motor pools. I mean, parking area, mechanic bays. They had tunnels that went clear back underneath the border going into Cambodia that they could literally drive a truck down. And I'm going, what? We found one north of Pleiku. If you read the book, The 13th Valley, the guy says that the story is fictitious. I've been in the valley. The big tree he talks about in the valley is there. I remember the battles that were there. We found tunnels up there. They found the vent hole for the tunnel. And you put what we call a tunnel rat down the tunnel. And little guy in your unit, give him a 45 flashlight, he goes down this little tunnel. You don't know what you're going to find. You don't know what's in there. It could be booby-trapped. It could be anything. But how far are you going to follow this trail? And I mean, if they got some of these tunnels that are long enough you can drive a truck in it, how far are you going to follow it? Well, he finally gave up, and we flew in gas generators and generated CS. Now, people think that this is a gas, and it's not. It's a persistent powder. And persistent means that it stays there. It's there for days out. You don't go back in a week and it's disseminated, it's gone. It's a persistent powder. So if you go down that tunnel a week later, you're going to stir up the gas. You're going to stir up the tear gas, and it's going to bother you. They pumped it in and pumped it in and pumped it in and pumped it in along with smoke and couldn't find any place where it was coming out. When they set the charges and blew it, they had a spot that just sunk, went for a mile or better, just dropped down into crazy stuff that, and you wonder how. Underground hospitals the same way. Foot-operated suction pumps. I don't know how. You know, I've listened to a lot of people complain about the VA. I've listened to a lot of people complain about our military. And we've got our problems. Still, it's the finest system in the world. With all its problems, it's still, and here we can complain about it. I don't know how well they could complain.
Yeah.
But I look at how hard we hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I look at the teams we put in that were working over the border, special forces camps that were all up and down the border, and literally these mountain yards, this was their backyard. You couldn't go through without leaving a sign you've been there. I don't know how. I don't know how the other side ever managed to fight and keep going. And I was there after Tet, and that's part of the reason we started getting nervous after several months and we weren't getting hit as hard. What are they saving this up for? When are we going to get hit with all this stuff? What are they doing? And we did have places that went under siege. Ben Het was up at the tri-border area where Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam come together. And it was under siege for months and months and months and months. And when it started, the Viet Cong planned everything out to just immense detail. They showed up with 2 P-76 tanks. These are the light amphibious tanks. Of course, that's kind of dumb because we have artillery there, and they just leveled their guns and used their direct fire sights and shot them like shooting any other tank. And it didn't make anything in the battle. But how do you get them in the jungle to that site for the battle? And they had went through choreographing this fight to such an extent that when it started, within minutes, there were Viet Cong Wasatcho charges running around inside the compound. They had dug tunnels underneath the barbed wire and brought them up inside the compound. We didn't know they were there. How you do that? I mean, I don't know. You know, I take a look at and take my hat off to him. I mean, you want to talk about a soldier. I mean, we referred to him as Chuck, you know, the VC, Viet Cong. A lot of respect.
All right. Now, while a place like Ben Het is effectively under siege and so forth, would you go in and out of there, or?
We tried. At one point, they brought a C-130 in and did a low-level extraction because the runway was actually inside the barbed wire at that compound. And they dropped fresh rations because they had regular mess hall there on the runway. They couldn't get them off. They couldn't get it off. The C-130 got so shot up, the wing fell off trying to go back to the Air Force Base. That's some pretty intense fighting.
And was that a special?
My wife wanted me to tell you about another guy, and we're talking about Ben Het, and his story is entwined with Ben Het. Lieutenants going over to Vietnam to an artillery unit normally spend half their time in the field and they're half their time in a fire direction center, a rear base, running the slide sticks or playing with a FADEC, a desk computer, to orient the guns to fire them and stuff like that. And they're normally in a base then someplace, fairly safe. They're not in the field anymore. And this one lieutenant they put out in the field, and he was good. But the Viet Cong, or the South Vietnam, when they got into a battle up where we were at, retreated. My brother-in-law says that the Arvins down by Saigon were good fighters, and I have no reason to doubt. But up where I am, most of them up where I was at, the judge gave an opportunity to go to war or go to jail. And they'd go out to the field and they would smoke their pot and do whatever and then wander back in later. I'd sit in the old man's briefings, and the Vietnamese would go out and they'd have sporadic contact, might have found a bloody bandage or something. We'd go out in the same area and we'd collect broken weapons and drag trails and much more blood and numerous contacts. The rocks would go into the area, and you'd have to send the deuce and a halfs in there to carry all the rice out and the weapons.
The rocks being the Korean soldiers.
Koreans, yeah. World of difference. The Vietnamese, just where I was at, were just not into the fight at all. And I can tell you some more stories about that are just. But every time they got in contact, they'd pull back, and our forward observer, this lieutenant, was left out there alone. And I remember one night sitting up all night. I mean, we tried that first day to get them out and couldn't. The aircraft got all shot up. But like I said, those aircraft took a lot of beating and came back, and usually the crew didn't get that. I mean, they talk about the life expectancy of a pilot, but it wasn't that bad. You're in combat. Matter of fact, I always felt sorry for the guys on the ground. I mean, I go in, they're all shooting at me, yeah, okay. But when I leave, they're all shooting at me, and then they go back to doing their fighting. But they're still there. I put up with it for how many minutes? Big deal. Anyway, this lieutenant was in a mortar crater, and on the radio, busy talking for help, directing artillery, trying to stay alive. We got him out. Last time that happened, we didn't. We found him several days later, along the major highway between Pleiku and Khartoum. His arms were broken, wrapped backwards around a tree the way they don't bend, and nailed to the tree. His privates were cut off and shoved in his mouth, and whether he bled to death or choked to death, I don't know. But he was a character. And when Ben Het was under siege, he was up there. Now, we talked about being out of contact with the world, back here with everything. But you're out of contact with everything. And again, I was very unique because I'm sitting in the old man's briefings. He's up at Dak To up there, and there's a staging field not too far from Dak To for the over-the-border missions. And there were all these supplies piled up. He looked at, he says, "What are these things?" "Oh, that's supplies to go to Ben Het." "Well, why ain't it at Ben Het?" "Well, Ben Het's under siege." "They're what? How long? What's going on down there?" He said, "Well, they got to have this stuff." Well, he disappeared. He come back with a Jeep. He loaded up a whole bunch of this stuff. Such as M16, the Jeep takes off, drives down the road, and drives right down to Ben Het. Now, the fighting down there was so bad, and you were asking about it, and I didn't tell you, but the main gate there, they had opened up to bring in a tank retriever. Now, a tank retriever has a V12 Continental engine in it. Don't ask me how many thousand horsepower, I don't remember. But it's literally built to grab a tank with the treads off it and drive a 60, 70-ton tank off the battlefield. That's a significantly built vehicle. And its total armament's a 50 caliber machine gun. Well, the enemy's going to shoot at this thing. I mean, it's built robust and heavy. They let it get in the gate, and they blew it up in the gate. That's how intense the fighting was. Well, the lieutenant comes driving down the road, drives around this thing in the gate, drops off the supplies. "Oh, well, we'll get you a room for the night. You're going to be staying here." "I can't do that. I got to go patrol in the morning." He gets back in the Jeep, drives all the way back. Nobody shot at him. I think it's one of those things where when you see the courage and you see somebody doing something that's really outstanding, you just sort of... But they never shot at him. They never just let him drive all the way down there and all the way back. And I was covering a convoy, too, that he was my liaison. And he was in the convoy. And he's in the lead vehicle. I told you it wasn't wrapped real tight. And all of a sudden, the whole convoy stops. And he jumps out of a vehicle and he runs into the jungle. I know this ain't the call of nature. I mean, what is going on? And I'm busy looking, and a short while later he comes back and he throws something in the back of the vehicle, and from where I'm at, it looks like he's got a bullwhip. I have no idea what's going on. And I asked him, he just gave me a fluff off. A couple days later, and I've got pictures of him, he's standing in front of our mess hall when I'm going down there for breakfast. And he's got his arms like this, and the snake is this big around, and its head is just barely touching, its tail is just barely. The snake was basking on the road, and it went into the jungles. So he ran off the road in the jungle with his .45, shot it twice behind the head, had to bring the snake back to throw it in the vehicle and gone down the road. I mean, you talk about being loose-wired. I think if you don't get loose-wired, I think you crack up. I mean, I've been police, and I dealt with fire departments and ambulance crews, and I'm a wilderness EMT. I've been in an ambulance to get my certifications in that, but I ain't interested. I don't think you deal with those things day in, day out, and don't develop some sort of weird sense of humor, and after a while you get sort of, okay, I'm getting shot at, so what? You know what? Getting shot at don't hurt. Getting hit's a bitch, but getting shot at don't hurt.
Sure.
I mean, they asked me, "You ever get shot at?" "Oh yeah, I got shot at a lot." Matter of fact, normal comment from me when they asked me what I did in Vietnam is I said I taught the enemy aerial gunnery. He says, "What?" "Well, yeah, I taught the enemy. They weren't very good." But that's again that levity. That's that you sort of come up with. The matter of fact, Mom told me I had an audition in here for you. I sang in a chorus at flight school, at primary flight school, and we went all over. We sang for the governor's inaugural address in Texas, and one of the songs we did was a parody on the Green Beret. You remember Barry Sadler and the Green Beret? And it went, tennis shoes upon his feet. Some people call him Sneaky Pete. He sneaks around the woods all day and wears that funny green beret. Now it's no jungle bore for me. I've never seen a rubber tree. 100 men will take the test while I fly home and take a rest. Silver wings upon my chest. I fly my chopper above the best. I can make more dough that way, and I don't need a green beret. Now, we had multiple verses to that, and we used to sing it up at the officers club and really get them wound up, you know. They finally came up with a parody to our song, and I didn't get it. I wish I had. And he talks about when the shooting starts and the mortars come in, we grab our choppers and fly away. And we did, you know, I mean, because good humor's got to have a kernel of truth to it, right? And we just sit and laughed our tails off listening to them because they were complaining about us being cowards and running, and you know, anything but the truth. But that's okay. I mean, that's just the way things were.
All right. When you were talking about sort of the Ben Het siege and dragging on for months, did the base eventually fall, or did the enemy go away?
They went away. I can't remember a single battle that we lost. And yet coming home, I went to the VVA, and third time I was there, one of the guys says, "Oh, you're the fellows who can't win the war." Oh, I was livid. I grabbed him and literally took him over the bar backwards.
You mean VFW, not VVA is VFW.
Yeah, VFW.
Yeah.
And I literally took him over the bar backwards, looked him square in the eye, and I said he was a dumb SOB. I says, if we're told to advance, you advance. You're told to sit down, you sit down. Told to retreat, you retreat. We ain't never lost a battle yet. Politicians are giving the war away and you're blaming us. And I walked out, never went back. And I'm not the only one that's had that type of experience.
No, you're not.
We didn't have anybody next door to talk to. We didn't know anybody else that had been there. Our families were split. It was difficult. I had my church, I had my family, and none of them ever once gave me the indication that I had done anything but what was requested and honored and what was appropriate. I never had those kind of problems, but yet I helped run some of the rap groups for the VVA, the Vietnam Veterans Association, because the guys didn't feel welcome anyplace else. We made our own group, and I helped run some of the rap groups for them, and it was enlightening because I'm unique. The Lord's given me very special opportunity. Every place I've been, I've not had the typical view of the business or the job or anything else. I saw everything from Saigon to literally landing out in the middle of the field and resupplying some patrols out there. And everything in between and back and forth. On a police department, I walked a footbeat 7 out of the 13 years because I requested it. And I was on special assignment from the chief. When I wasn't normally in a regular car, although I got that once in a while. I was normally a backup car. So it means I ran overlap on everybody else, and if you got a bad call, I went along. Of course, if you were busy, I got your call, and they sent somebody from a neighboring district to back me up. But I got all the bad calls. Every place I've been, everything I've ever done has always been that way. So Vietnam, very interesting when you talk to guys from there and you deal with the group. What did he do? Was he assigned to a fire base? And he was at this little bitty outpost in the middle of the jungle with 1,000 foot of cleared space to the jungle, and he was responsible for taking care of his gun and firing his gun, and he's eating C rations and basically living in a bunker. Was he infantry and on patrol? My mechanic very seldom ever saw anything but the rear base we were at, and yet they sprayed the rear base we were at 6 times with Agent Orange. He found out that through Freedom of Information Act. They fought him and weren't going to help him. He literally went to a private clinic, had blood samples taken, and proved that he had Agent Orange in his fat samples, because that's where it tends to concentrate. So then he went back through Freedom of Information Act, and the rear echelon base we were on got sprayed 6 times over there. Now, I never had any doubt I was exposed, because I'm landing outside these fire bases. Well, if I take a commander out there, you got this one helipad inside the base. Well, if I shut down and tie up the aircraft there, who else is landing? So I'd pick up and go outside the base and land by the main gate and then walk back in. Well, you land out there and it's a brownout. I mean, you look through your chin bubble and find a weed to land to, because you lose all orientation. There's nothing growing out there for 1,000 yards. Why does nothing grow in the tropics in a jungle area for 1,000 yards? I mean, it takes somebody that's dingbatty not to consider that, oh, I've been exposed to a defoliant. Oh. So, yeah, you know, I was heavily exposed. And then they're going to say, do you think you were? Duh. Yeah. But everybody sees something different. I mean, I came closest to getting killed in Saigon. Flew the old man down there and landed at Hotel Delta. And he sent a Jeep back for me, and he told me he wasn't going to need me till 4 o'clock, do whatever I wanted to do. Well, aircraft's where it's going to be watched. I don't have to watch it. I'm inside a secure area. Interesting term. You know, when they make a secure area, they never tell the enemy it's secure. It's weird. Anyway, so I went with this PFC, and he says, what do you want to do, sir? And I says, well, I'd like to get something to eat. And he says to me, okay. And I says, let's go someplace where you can eat. Well, he didn't hear me. So he took me to one of the officers' clubs. And this is a 3-story building. And of course, I don't know where I'm at, because I don't know Saigon. And I take one look, and I realize it's an O Club. So I says to him, I says, it's an O Club, you can't come in. I says, isn't there a place you know on the economy? I said, I'll take care of your lunch. I said, take us to a place where we can eat. He said, oh, okay. So he drives around the corner, and after we went around the corner, somebody with a push cart had put it up in front of the officers' club and blew the front end off the officers' club. If I had been typical officer, I guess typical officer, I don't know what a typical is, but I was raised, you take care of your men. And there have been times where I landed with a Huey when I'm flying with one of the other units and says, I'll stay with the aircraft, because somebody had to stay, and let everybody else go get lunch. And I'll go later. I was trained, you take care of your men first. And there's an interesting phrase they use, RHIP, rank has its privilege. But I don't think most enlisted men understand. I flew the commander quite often right through meals. Now, I could object, because I'm a pilot and I have military regulation. And unless it's a life or death combat situation, I'm required to have my meals. He can't fly me through dinner. So I had arrangements. I could go to the mess hall and eat anytime I wanted. And that sounds really great until you realize that I'm skipping meals. Or maybe I don't get any meal at all because of what's going on. So then all of a sudden being able to skip in line or get to the front or whatever ain't such a big deal. So a lot of these things where rank has its privilege really ain't no privilege at all. It's because of what you're doing, and it's because of the way things are. But I learned early, you get in the military, make friends as a supply sergeant and make friends as the cook. And I flew commanders. So I'm coming back to base, I'd call and say I'm bringing the commander in, call his Jeep, tell him to be here. By the way, call over to the mess hall and tell the cook to meet me at, if he wants to go for a ride. We had on our base a 2.5-ton truck with a fuel tank on the back. Now, a Huey burns a gallon of fuel a minute. So if we're fueling that Huey and it runs for 2 hours and 15 minutes, that's quite a number of gallons. So you can, we have dozen smaller aircraft, and you're going to fuel all these. Well, that tank doesn't go a long ways. So you're refueling it every day, sometimes a couple times during the day. Nah. So what we would do is we'd fly over to Camp Holloway, over the Air Force Base. We'd refuel over there because they have the big ground bladders and stuff like that and the pumps. Then we'd fly back, put it in the revetment. We'd just top the tank off.
Mhm.
Well, if you mind if I go over and refuel while you take a ride around Pleiku? No, you're going for your carnival ride, right? So I got trading material left and right. You know, you're going to go with the cook, you're going to go with the supply sergeant, have them take their camera, fly them around their base, fly them around Pleiku, anything special you want to see, you know, fly them around there. Mom gets a kick out of me talking. You know, the Vietnamese, Orientals, communal showers, baths, stuff like that, is quite acceptable in their country. And there was a river junction out there in the rice paddies where they used to go swimming. It was a local bathing hole. And it was on the way if you're low level and going around town. And the girls would stand up there on the bank and wave at you. They weren't wearing bikinis. And the guy, whoa, whoa, go back and circle that way. You know. If you circle them, the girls just love it. They'll sit and wave at you all day long, you know. And the guys just love stuff like that, but it was very different. So different to the point where you talked about being observant and that. I can remember I'm covering out there and there's a mom and son. Every evening we'd go around our base and look for anything different. One ship was assigned to do that. And you go out and you go out and you look for anything different. And I'm out around one night and there's this guy and this gal, and figure they're a couple. She's obviously pregnant and they're working their rice paddies. And you come by the next night, she ain't there, he's there. Come back the next night, and she's there, he's there, and here's this little bundle on the rice paddy dike. I mean, you just, it's like you get to know some of the people. It's funny because you see them everywhere. It's like funny stuff. When the weather's bad, we were trained to fly instruments, and that's IFR, Instrument Flight Rules. But we didn't do it. And if it was acceptable at all, we went down the road. Now you're 6 inches off the highway and doing 125 miles an hour and just hugging the highway. And you come down the highway like that, and here's be some little guy on his little 90cc moped, right? And he's looking at you and you're going, hey, pay attention to the road, and he zoop in the ditch. Look just like laughing. They go, we didn't win any friends. You know, and you do whatever you want, tell him to watch the road, and he's looking at you, and he in the ditch. And I pick up and go over him. I ain't going to hit him, but it's one of the things you remember of him running down the highway. You know, we hear, I was in a college class, finance, and the guy next to me is a retired engineer, captain, lieutenant colonel. And they brought up about poor. And I says, we don't have any poor. And the class was 2/3 female and 2/3 black. And they just levitated. And how can you say such a thing? And they're just, I've been in a number of third world countries, and our poor live better than the top 10% in those countries. I don't remember in Saigon seeing many cars, or in Pleiku. But them little mopeds going everywhere. And man, how you get 4 or 5 people on a moped? They got them. And if they got this pig in a basket they're bringing, he's on the moped. And how they get that, I don't know how they do it. But it's just, it's a different world. And we just have no concept of how good we got it. Matter of fact, I sat one night on my bunk thinking, it was the first time that everything I owned went into a B4 bag in my briefcase.
All right.
And I was living well.